the Salinity committee meeting today. Happy to have you all here. I think we have a nice full agenda. Hopefully you all have a chance to review that, but I'll just, maybe we do a round of introductions and then keep going. I'll just start since I'm talking anyway. I'm Ben Stireman with the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And
I'm Ryan Rowland with the U.S. Geological Survey.
Christine Rumsey, U.S. Geological Survey.
I'm Jennifer Bates with Forestry, our state lands.
And Jeff Denblaker with Jacobs, facilitating.
Mark Reynolds, U.S. Bag Museum.
Joe Havasey, Compass Minerals.
John Hunt, Wildlife Resources.
Thomas Bill Steele's Branching Cooperative.
just want to get back here.
Bill Berm, Brancham Cooperative.
Elliot Cheknecki, Utah Geological Survey.
Ryan Doherty, Cargill.
Tim Locks, Branching Cooperative.
Laura Vernon, Water Resources.
Ben Holcomb, Water Quality.
Nancy Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
I'm Ryan Bartlett with Compass Minerals.
Great. Well, thank you. And then let's see online. I see we got Rob Dubuque, Friends of Great Salt Lake, Marissa Weinberg with Forestry, Fire, and I thought I saw her here. With Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, Layla Amati with Water Resources, and Jim Harris with DWQ, Jake Srago with Water Resources, and is that everybody online? All right. Great. Well, thank you everybody for being here. We've got like Ben said, we've got a full agenda here. Just to give you just a quick overview here, number of updates that we want to do just on lake conditions like we typically do, an update on the Berm protocol, management protocol. Christine has a really great presentation, just an update on the work that she and others have been doing on salinity data from the lake. And then I think in terms of new topics, wanted to, I guess, do a little bit of housekeeping on our salinity and density standard operating procedure document. I sent that out to the salinity community members with some suggested changes to update that. And then I wanted to, I guess, talk about the Berm management protocol, not in that we're going to revise that right now, but what just in light of the conditions that we have, I guess I want to start thinking about what we want to do later this summer, what kinds of data that we want to do. And I think, Phil, did you have some data that we look at? One of the things we talked about at the last meeting was just, how, and, the SOP talks about how we measure salinity and how we calculate that. But what we started talking about at our last meeting was where we measure salinity. And so, we've got a long record of salinity data, and we started talking about, well, is there a different depth that we might want to start adding that to our list of areas that we measure, so we can track that as well. And Phil has taken a look at their data sets, and he's going to give us a look at what the comparisons that they've been doing. And then want to just close out with some action items. We can go forward and talk about our next meetings. So I guess back here, we already done introductions. I just realized I don't think I sent the meeting summary out this last week to you, but I sent it out a couple of months ago. I don't know if you all had a chance to look at that when I sent that out. It's part of the package with just reviewing the protocol document and getting your approval on that. Did anybody have any comments on, if you can recall, on that? Come on, John, you remember that.
I can't remember my name. From love.
Go Aces.
We maybe just want to send it out after this and then review next on our next meeting, make sure everybody's comfy with what it says.
Let's do that. So any other things that we want to talk about, I guess, on the agenda today? All right, I guess then we can jump to the update on lake conditions. I'm assuming this was the file.
Yeah. So we'll tag team as usual. So we'll go over lake elevation and some discharge and velocity data at the new breach. Christine will then jump in with salinity information. Next slide. All right, so lake surface elevation for the south arm. So here's data for our Saltair gauge, showing data from roughly October of 2019 through the current period here. You see the very nice rise in water level elevation, water surface elevation, beginning in mid to late November through the current period. So as of yesterday, we were at 4193.1 feet. So we're up about 4.6 feet since the low in November of 2022. So recall we have a berm that's been raised to 4192 out there. So that's been in play and contributing to this rapid rise that we see in the south arm. So it's always important to keep that in mind as we look at water surface elevation data. Next slide, please. So lake surface elevation for the north arm. Same period of record shown on the plot. The most recent data, it's obvious we don't see as much of a rise at this site. As of yesterday, the average daily value was 4189.4 feet. So we're up about 9/10 of a foot since November, the low in November of 2022. And this would be a good thing for the group to discuss thoughts on why we're not seeing much of an increase at this site. I mean, obviously the berm is in play, but the current elevation on the south arm is allowing for spilling over the berm. So it'll just be something that would be good to discuss with the group to get thoughts on when we'll see more of a response, or why we see things kind of leveling out. If you look at that most recent data, you see how there's just not much increase, and maybe even a slight decrease over the last few weeks. Next slide, please. All right, some really, really good news for Great Salt Lake. So let's just look at the cumulative flow in millions of acre feet for our major gauges, major inflow gauges. So this is the Bear River near Corinne, Utah. The bold black line is the current year of data. So the x-axis shows a water year, so October through September of the following year. The blue is the highest ever measured cumulative flow. The green zone is 25th to 75th percentile, and there's a faint gray line in the middle of the green zone. That's the median cumulative flow. And then the yellow line is the lowest ever measured cumulative flow. Bold black line, really nice slope on that line since February. And currently it's on an upward trajectory, which is fantastic. We're just above the median right now for Bear River, Corinne. And we expect we've got more snow to move downstream past this gauge. So it'll be really fun to watch how this gauge plays out the rest of the year. Water year. Next slide, or hit the next button. Okay, same kind of plot for our Farmington Bay outflow gauge. Bold black line is above the blue. So this is currently, we have, for this day of the year, we have the highest ever cumulative flow up to this point in the water year. So fantastic news for Great Salt Lake. And again, that y-axis is cumulative stream flow in millions of acre feet. Next slide. Or just next, yeah. Weaver River near Plain City, Utah. The black line has a fantastic looking steep slope that started in late February, early March. We're above the 75th percentile, and we know there's more water to come downstream. So it'll be fun to see where we end up at this site in terms of the historic record. Next. And then Goggin Drain. An important site for
0.5 and 3 meters at 3510 in Gilbert Bay. Both were 155 grams per liter, so we didn't see any vertical gradient there at that site at that time. At 2565, we did. So the shallow half-meter above bottom sample was 142 grams per liter, whereas the 3 meter below surface was 153 grams per liter. So it did see a difference there. And these there maybe the deep layer, we didn't see evidence of a deep brine, but probably the deep samples were like 5 grams per liter higher, just to give you a little idea. So some gradient there. Next slide. And then this is the last slide I have. I wanted to just start to help us understand spatial variability in these 4 GSLEP sample sites. So these are just shallow salinities, and I'm starting from last September, kind of those September, October, November, and then January through April. So in the fall, first thing you can tell is that we're freshening across the lake from fall to now. And also in the fall, we see much more homogeneity in the salinities, the surface salinities. Then when we started to see fresh water coming in, we begin to see a little bit of variability across the south arm, especially at 2267 where the Bear River comes in, and also at 2767, which is where Farmington Bay outflow is. So just to give you all an idea of how we see variability, I'll continue to build these throughout the season, and I'm curious to see when we see it to be, we see it well mixed again. This year might be a little bit different than other years, but that's about all I have. Any questions?
You want to take?
Do you want to go to the other agenda item? I'm happy to keep going, but.
Oh, yes.
Not much of an update for the protocol. We appreciate the recommendations from the committee, and we've been going through review and kind of doing all of our diligence items to be able to adopt that. We're contemplating being able to adopt that now without any changes. So we're very happy with the way the recommendation was written. And I think that the main update is that what we're planning to do is we will most likely adopt it as is, knowing that this is an interim protocol. And I think this year will be interesting to see if there's, how things level off and whether a modification will even be necessary, if levels actually level out. But we are going to be starting our comprehensive management plan soon, and we're hoping that with the April deadline to have a new, more robust protocol, that we would officially adopt a protocol as an appendix to our comprehensive management plan. So that's how we're seeing this moving forward. But for now, we're working on adopting the recommendation as is.
Any questions on that? I guess thank you all, because that took a lot of effort to get the protocol developed and then approved. So it's great to have that getting into place. So I guess if not, we can get back to you.
Okay, cool. Okay, so we kind of gave an update of this probably, 6 months ago or something, but we have a few more findings and we're getting super close to a complete draft on this work. And it was originally started as a forestry for St. Lands hot topics grant, and then it kind of ballooned into a monster. So this is work that myself, Scott Henick, and others that our office have been working on, as well as we've roped in folks from UGS, Utah State, Division of Water Resources, and Phil from the Brancham Cooperative. So I'll kind of give you a quick version of our recent findings. So go ahead, Jeff. Our key study objectives, to kind of orient everyone to what we're trying to do here, was to kind of collate all of our data, salinity data, profile data, into what we call a data release that is publicly available to everyone on the web. And we also have verified the existing equation of state. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but just know that we were able to collect samples in 2021 and 22. We validated the existing equation of state, which allows us to measure a density and a temperature and compute an estimated salinity. And those data will also be published in the data release. And then the 3 main objectives I'm going to talk about today will be summarized in a journal article, and they are calculating the salt mass in the upper and deep layers of the south arm, kind of figuring out how salt is partitioned in the south arm, understanding salt mass fluctuations over time, and then estimating salt mass exchange across the causeway, as well as salt loading from rivers. So next slide. And just to put everything into context, we all know that the causeway has significantly altered the water and salt balance of the Great Salt Lake. And there's been a number of modifications made to the causeway and its openings over time. This is a nice plot that Ryan prepared. So we're looking at lake water surface elevations for north and south arms from 1985 to present. So over here would kind of be that lakeside breach being constructed at the high stand in the 80s, 1984. And then you can see a series of modifications have been made to the lakeside breach in 96 and around 2000. And then we get into the more recent era where we have the culverts closing, the new breach opening, and then berm modification. So if you toggle one more, Jeff, this is our period of analysis, is roughly the last 12 years, covering 3 different kind of berm paradigms, or breach or causeway paradigms, management paradigms. So when the culverts were open, when they were closed, and then when West Crack was open. So, and also I start to use West Crack as an equivalent to new breach. That's kind of what we call it affectionately at USGS. So sorry, those are the same things. But just to give you an idea, we're covering kind of multiple periods of causeway paradigms here. Next slide. And we kind of rope in a ton of different data. As you all know, we partner with state agencies to monitor salinity through a number of different programs. Our kind of gold star standard data set that we like the best because it has monthly data is the GSLIP, the foresight GSLIP network. So these salinity data are really key and are the backbone to this whole analysis. They're kind of hard to see, but you're probably familiar with where they are, all in the South Arm. We're also roping in data from 7 Division of Water Quality sites where we sample twice per year in June and October. And then we rope in data from the Saltaire gauge down at the south end of the lake, at West Crack, where we collect salinity data roughly every 8 weeks, lakeside breach when it's flowing every 6 weeks, and also we use data from the Utah Geological Survey, which their sites are sampled 1 to 3 times per year. So we're basically just trying to say, okay, we have all these different monitoring programs. How are salt mass estimates affected by these different data sets? Can they tell us something about the robustness of our ability to estimate salt mass, and are they interchangeable? Are they kind of overlapping? So next slide. So using the foresight Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program salinity data, we computed South Arm dissolved salt mass in millions of tons. So that's shown here as these dots in blue, that's South Arm. And then because we wanted to really kind of start to learn about why we see fluctuations in South Arm, we also worked with Andrew and Elliot and they computed North Arm dissolved salt masses for us to just kind of see how these are related over time. And again, we're looking from 2010 to July of 2022. And I should mention that our study period ends on July 27th, 2022. The subsequent day, the berm was raised. And so our period of study kind of precedes that modification. But what we can learn from this is that there have been, many fluctuations in South Arm salt mass. In 2011, we had a big water year, a lot of flow moving from south to north. We exported salt, see an increase in North Arm dissolved salt mass, and then it kind of re-equilibrates again. When culverts are closed, we see a kind of a gradual decline. And Jeff, if you want to click one more, I think there's some arrows there. Yeah. And then, of course, when West Crack was opened in December of 2016, we saw a really large magnitude kind of step down in South Arm dissolved salt mass. And then what Phil Brown brought to everyone's attention a couple of years ago and kind of caught the attention of this group was this increase in salt mass of the South Arm from roughly, the fall of 2017 to present. And so this is us kind of just getting a bird's eye view of how these changes have been happening and how they relate to the North Arm. So often, when we see decreases in South Arm, that corresponds with an increase in North Arm, suggesting there's this connectivity of exchange, but not always. Okay, so next slide. And then we dug into the South Arm and just asked, okay, well, where is the salt in the South Arm? So we quantified salt in the upper brine layer and then layers below what we're calling chemocline and Carrington Bay in red, and then in Gilbert Bay in orange. And if you click one more, Jeff, what we see is that there's variability, the amount of salt that's held below the chemocline, which is largely the same as the deep brine layer, but there are periods of time when we have big freshwater inflows, and we do see a salinity gradient in the South Arm that is that still develops a chemocline. But so we use this general term just to make that clear. It's dynamic. The mass held below the chemocline is dynamic through time, really corresponding with when culverts were opened or closed, or when there were openings through the causeway. We see the mass is below the chemocline when there are openings in the causeway, and when they were closed, we saw that disappear. And then most recently, if you click one more time, what's interesting is that we saw this decline in the mass held below, salt mass below the chemocline, likely what we're hypothesizing due to low lake levels, and many others have hypothesized the same thing, that we just kind of, wind energy is now able to mix mix further in the water column to kind of mix out that deep brine layer as lake levels go down. So next slide. And to assess our estimates of salt mass in the South Arm upper brine layer, we kind of threw the kitchen sink at it using all these different data sets. That's what's shown here is the difference in mean monthly upper brine layer salt mass from 2010 to present for all these different data sets. And all the data sets are compared to the foresight Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program network. So as you can see, what's really encouraging about this is that most of the time, these mean monthly salt mass estimates fall within 10% of the GSLEP. So that means like if GSLEP collects a set of samples at their 4 sites in a given month, and we collect one at Saltaire, there's a really good likelihood that Saltaire does just as good of a job at estimating South Arm salt mass in the upper brine as this foresight GSLEP network. That just gives us confidence in our ability to estimate salt mass, as well as gives us some redundancy. So if we miss a sampling out on the lake, we have kind of a backup data sets that we can still use. And what we quantified is that, within 8%, that 95% of the time, all of these data sets are within 8% of the GSLEP foresight estimate. So pretty encouraging that way. Okay, and this is kind of getting into the meat of it. So we've documented this change, we've documented how salt is partitioned in the South Arm, and we really wanted to try and dig into why this South Arm salt mass was increasing during the period of 2017 to the present. And so the data sets we bring to bear on this question are looking at what is coming in via the river inflows, what's being exchanged at West Crack, both from south to north and north to south, and what is leaving via lakeside. So these are the kinds of things we have data on, we can actually quantify. And so we took an attempt to do that and just see if we can account for everything. So if you go to the next slide, what we started off doing was calculating a daily salt flux. So this is basically saying how much mass passes a given site in a given day. So units are in millions of tons per day. And from fall of 2017 to the present, this plot is from December of 2016 to the present. And we quantified south to north flux using monthly discharge estimates from USGS. As you can see, those are kind of the dots, and we kind of connect them, computing salt mass or salt flux on a given day, and kind of computing the spaces in between. So south to north, what's moving, salt mass moving from south to north is in blue, salt mass moving from north to south. So being imported into the South Arm is in kind of this red salmon color. Lakeside, so that's another export right here, what's going out on the west end of the lake into the north. That's shown in purple, and then the river inflows are shown in blue. So what we learned right away is that most of the action is happening at West Crack. These are the largest salt fluxes out of any that we're able to quantify. And we also learned that the greatest export of salt from south to north occurs with a rise in South Arm lake elevations, which is shown in this gray line and corresponds to that axis on the right. So when we have an increase in lake level in the south, you might expect we get a greater salt flux both at West Crack and at Lakeside. And then what's really cool is that when then we start to see the South Arm lake level decline again, is when we see the North Arm kind of flux overpowering the south to north flux. So how I envision it is the South Arm comes up, it begins to spill into the North Arm, which fills, and then the South Arm starts to drop. There's kind of this lag, and kind of then it begins to flow back into the South Arm. And that's what we observe in many years in this period of record. So this was our first attempt, and I think this is what we shared with you previously. And if you recall, doing all of the accounting on this and comparing it to our rise in South Arm salt mass, which is around 100 million tons, that we were ending up with a discrepancy of around like 400 million tons, where we were estimating there was actually more salt leaving the South Farm than was coming in, and it didn't make a lot of sense. So we revisited this, if you go to the next slide, by reaching out and working with our colleagues at Utah State. So they were actively trying to estimate daily or sub-daily discharge at West Crack using USGS continuous data records of velocity and other variables. And we said, hey, can we use these, can we try them and see how this affects our salt flux estimates at West Crack? And so this is the same plot. However, now I've overlain kind of our daily salt fluxes using that new discharge data set as these kind of red dashed lines is from north to south, and the blue kind of really blue lines that are moving all over the place are from south to north. So you can see we are not capturing like basically any of the variability that actually occurs at that site. And just from being out there, we are familiar with how West Crack behaves. This is just much more in line with reality. It responds to winds, it responds to different forcings. And so this gave us a lot of confidence that, you know, it's closer to what reality is. So you can't see here, but we really want to thank Sam and his students for allowing us to use those discharge estimates. So then I think we can go to the next slide. Then another way to look at this is to look at the cumulative salt flux in millions of tons at this site. So blue is flux from south to north, and the ANN model, that's Sam's daily estimated discharge, is the solid blue, and then our interpolated USGS measurements are these dashed lines. So south to north there, and then north to south similarly in kind of that salmon color. So what kind of blew our minds here is just how these two different discharge data sets really flipped the story completely. So if we were to use just our monthly interpolated estimates of USGS data, so these ones in dashed lines here, from fall of 2017 to present, you see the cumulative amount of mass that's past that site. It would estimate that there was over 260 million tons that had left from south to north. So much more salt leaving than coming in. However, when we use Sam's daily ANN discharge data set, the story is completely reversed, and we are now estimating that there's more salt coming in from north to south on a magnitude of about 70 million tons. So this just made so much more sense to us. We were really glad to use this, and it really hit home the idea that if we want to understand salt flux at West Crack, we need a daily discharge data set or a sub-daily discharge data set to quantify that accurately. So that's an important lesson that we were able to demonstrate and quantify here. So, and then the next one, I think kind of the next slide brings it all together. Yeah.
And I just want to, it's that uplooker velocity data that I kind of always go over quickly here. And then we also have a weather sensor out there. Those data are used to train the ANN model, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So,
As well as wind data, wind speeds, density, and watershed elevation.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So then if we kind of sum everything that's coming in and going out, here's this is what we end up with. So cumulative salt flux again in millions of tons per day, fall of 2017 to present. And I'll walk us through what each of these lines mean. So this red color, that's our north to south cumulative flux. The big blue line is our cumulative south to north flux. Lakeside is in purple. Rivers are in this dashed blue line. And then this dashed green line is kind of the net. So what's coming in from north to south, as well as rivers, the sum of that over this time period is 708 million tons. What's going out at West Crack, south to north, and at Lakeside, 667 million tons. And then if we compare that, so that the net of that is that we're importing 40 million tons into the South Arm, which is, again, encouraging because previously we were just saying, it's all just going somewhere and we have this massive source of salt we don't know about. So now it's much more in line with reality, but we're still missing around 50 million tons during this 5-year period. And so if we go to the next slide, we have a few ideas we explore in the paper about what those sources of salt could be. One is the return flows from mineral extraction ponds. We've done back of the envelope calculations on this using assumptions that were kind of presented in the Merck and Tarbotten paper whereas where 25% of the withdrawals are coming back into the south arm. And if we do that, then we get about 35 million tons of the salt is explained over that 5-year period. So that's a lot of the 15 million ton discrepancy. But we have no idea how accurate those assumptions are.
We can provide values. I mean, I have exact values.
Right. Let's
For
do
that, but it's not even close to that. It's an order of magnitude less.
Yeah, that would be.
We're
great
not that
for
good at it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I kind of so our approach in the paper has been, we can use these assumptions. We have no idea how good they are. So if we want to actually know this, we need to monitor it. And so another source would be groundwater, which folks at UGS have been quantifying. And our back of the envelope calculations with that are that it would explain maybe 3 to 4 million tons. So it is coming in, but it's not a huge source of salt relative to other sources. Another idea is salt flux through the fill material of a 30-kilometer long causeway. Got a lot of kind of length there where water could seep through from north to south. And we've looked at using hydrostatic pressure comparisons of north arm and south arm. We can actually see that through the majority of the water column, there is force that would drive flow from north to south through the causeway fill. So understanding the permeability of that and understanding its transportabilities would be really helpful. And then another fun source of salt could be the salt crust that's migrating from the Newfoundland Basin. So in the 1980s, during the high stand of the Great Salt Lake, they pumped like 500 million tons, if I'm not mistaken, of salt into the Newfoundland Basin area. And Brenda Bowen and her student have previously kind of documented how this salt crust is decreasing in surface area. And there's also evidence to show it's actually migrating toward the Great Salt Lake. So it's moving east and kind of potentially, the flow paths suggest that it could be getting into Great Salt Lake. So that's another source of salt that could be worth becoming curious about. And then the error. There's, because we were able to show there was such a big difference in the West Crack salt flux estimates using 2 different discharge data sets. I mean, if we can refine the discharge, I think that would be a really excellent thing to try and do, as I assume there is still error in the salt flux estimates that we have. So with that, I think I'm done. I just kind of wanted to acknowledge everyone who was a part of this. And that's on the next slide. And, oh wait, there's one more, sorry. Implications for salinity management. Okay, so what have we learned from this that might be relevant to this group? We argue that the existing salinity monitoring is quite robust for the south arm. The greatest magnitude salt fluxes are occurring at the causeway breaches, particularly at West Crack, by far. That's the source of greatest internal salt cycling. And if we really want to nail this down and get accurate estimates of flux, we need daily to sub-daily discharge estimates from West Crack. And it's important to consider there may be other south arm salt sources, but more monitoring would be needed to confirm that. So.
Christine, where on Newfoundland Basin, where the salt is potentially migrating, where is it coming into the lake at?
We think it's coming in near the lakeside gauge, which makes us wonder if it's actually not getting into the south arm at all, because it could just be kind of routing into the north arm. It's unclear exactly what it does when it reaches the side, but we have documented, flow events where there's really high connectivity water flowing from the north at Lakeside. So if you're at Lakeside Breach, it's kind of flowing from the north into the breach, but it's kind of unclear where it's going.
And it would, so if it's coming from the Newfoundland Basin, it would come around the southern tip of Hogget Range and then kind of flow along that eastern shore of Hogget. And you can see it during the spring. And then it flows north towards the causeway, and there's actually like a little drain adjacent to the toe of the causeway.
That was what I had thought as well, but there was an event this spring where I observed water coming into the south arm through that portion of the breach, and it just seems like, if we're looking for simple solutions on salinity, that might be something where we can quantify that and make sure that it's in the north arm.
Right. There is a canal that crosses the upland extension of the causeway between the causeway and Strong's Knob, and then discharges into the north arm. I'd be interested to see where he saw the south arm inflow.
Yeah. Just one other quick thought too. There's also been discussions about, with how much water is out in Newfoundland Basin, there's a gentleman that's probably contacted everybody in the room, but talked about, potentially making dikes or something to try to push some of that water or drain it into the North Arm. I think it's a cool idea, but there would be some salinity challenges, and we'd have to think really hard about what that might do, but something to consider if we start dropping it.
And I'll just pipe in a little bit on the lake side. So we have a gauge at the lake, the westernmost breach, the lakeside breach. That gauge is, we cannot measure those really small flows coming from potentially the Newfoundland Basin and through that lakeside breach. Some of that flow it's braided. Some of it ends up just going right into the North Arm, as Ben mentioned. Some of it goes through the lakeside breach itself, but it's very shallow. We have to run an index velocity. So we have an uplooker velocity meter there. We have to have enough depth to run that uplooker velocity meter in order to run a rating, a discharge rating at that site. And those really small flows, they're relatively small flows, we just can't really gauge. So the lakeside gauge is really most effective for south and north flows. As the South Arm rises, we'll start seeing more flow through that lakeside gauge. We'll have enough depth for our uplooker velocity to essentially work. So I'm all with, Ben mentioned, or, if we can figure out a way to get all that flow coming in from Newfoundland Basin just to dump into the North Arm and not have to try to quantify that flow. Going, if it's going directly into the South Arm, let's figure out a way to measure it. If we can avoid that, that would be a good thing. Basically, to bring all that to the North Arm so it comes through eventually through the new breach.
Are there any monitoring wells up there, around there?
We have a water well
Water.
right at Lakeside, pretty close to the railroad abutment there. Pretty sure it's in bedrock, but it's not too deep. But you do have some infill, that are in some of those valleys around Lakeside.
Yeah.
But we did a little groundwater investigation on the Lakeside lease, Coleman lease, upland, and you do hit a pretty robust sand layer at about 20 feet that's artesian. Oh yeah, it's greater than South Arm concentration for the ions that we're interested in.
Good.
Yeah.
Remind me again, what was the number that you were missing, the unaccounted for number?
About 50 million tons over a 5-year period.
Joe, do you
3
know
million.
off the top of your head what your discharge is in tons?
We're on average 3 to 4 million. Good year, maybe 5.
Per year.
That in itself would make up half of that.
Yes.
Because it's a cumulative.
Yeah, is that
50 million
annually
tons.
or?
The 50 million is over, it's from about 2017 to 2022. It's roughly a 5-year period.
That was about 3 million per year.
Yeah, 10 million.
But we had coordinated through water resources, like I had given those figures to Erica and water resources last summer.
No, not saying it's wrong. I just think that that's not part of their model or what they've been discussing. So I think we need to, if we can account for that, then it just helps tell the story better.
Yeah, but it's on that scale, and it's been 3-ish, just because the bear hasn't been flowing robustly in the past few years.
I mean, it would explain at least 30% of that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Mhm.
Yeah, that's a big jump.
Yeah.
You get pretty dialed, Christine. You've almost nailed it.
It's pretty exciting to not have a 400 million ton discrepancy.
Do we, have for the South Arm track,
We don't have returns.
you don't have returns.
Morton does, but I think it's just minor. Go look that up.
And we have the withdrawals, as I understand, from the Division of Water Resources. We can quantify the mass that's taken out. And then kind of pairing it with Joe's estimate of what's coming back in would be really helpful. Yeah. Cool.
So I guess another follow-on question is, do you need to do, what is needed to be able to get to that daily discharge? Or sub-daily discharge measurement?
Yeah, so Sam and his, they're gonna try to develop a rating, I think, based on the new elevation. I shouldn't say I think, I mean, they're doing research.
Yeah.
Now, modeling work as the berm exists today, so based on that new elevation. So anytime the berm elevation changes, we're gonna have to continue to collect data so that he can build a rating for that berm elevation. So over time, I think he'll be able to develop ratings for different berm elevations. And so when adjustments are made in outgoing years, he'll have a rating and we can continue doing some validation type monitoring. Once all these ratings for different berm elevations are done, we can continue to do some validation monitoring to ensure the models are holding true. I think that would be a kind of a long-term scenario that will play out. But it's going to take time. Every time the berm elevation changes, more and more data needs to be collected.
So I don't recall it. Marissa maybe can weigh in, but I don't know if we had to send out the letters yet for awarding the tech team grants. But I know that was one of Sam's research topics, and I won't say whether we awarded it or not.
We did send out letters.
Oh.
So Sam has been notified.
Yeah, so some was awarded that grant, so we're looking forward to being able to model that better. And then this coming year, we also did get an appropriation for modifying the berm and being able to move forward with that. So I think as a matter of maybe like some future Salinity committee topics, we could discuss, what other measurements we would need to accurately, inform that, because I think that some of that funding we could use to really dial in the data we're collecting, so we have really good informed information that we're trying to modify that in the future.
Great. Thank you. I'm just thinking, Phil, would your data fit well here?
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time.
I think just in terms, I think it's super encouraging that the measurements that you've been making, that different groups have been making around the lake are so consistent. I think that's usually where the lake seems like everything's different. We have things that are challenging, and so it's nice to see that here we actually have some consistency. Grades off. Yeah. And I think where this fits in is just, you talked a little bit about the 0.5 and the 3 meter or 3 meter depths. How those are consistent. I think Phil's got some based on their data sets.
Yeah. So we wanted to present some of the salinity data that we collect because part of our routine monitoring program where we hit 9 sites across Gilbert Bay each time we go out, and we try to sample at multiple depths and we capture salinity at those. And it's been an interesting year with all the inflow coming in. We have people around the office that'll ask us when we go out, what's the salinity out there? And this year, that's a complicated question to answer because with all the river inflow not mixing in immediately, creating a lot of heterogeneity, the answer to that really isn't one answer. It really depends on where on the lake you're sampling, what depth you're sampling, and what date you're sampling. Next slide. So just a brief overview of our last 2 sampling dates. The map on the left is April 14th. The one on the right is April 26th. And those are our 9 sample locations on the lake. And this is just presenting the salinity measurements at 1 meter, which is the shallowest we collect on our program. On April 14th, the average of all those was 142 grams per liter. But if you look at the individual sites, you can see quite a bit of variability on that 1 meter salinity, depending on where you are at the lake. And some of those sites are quite far from the river inflow points, you might note. At least on this date, the lowest salinities were out by Stansbury Island and Carrington Island, which is not where the river inflows are coming in. It's suggesting that this plume of water coming in from the river inflows gets moved with currents and winds, and you can't necessarily predict where it's going to be, because on April 26th, 2 weeks later, average salinity 144, a similar variability in range, but at this point, the shallowest, the most dilute salinities were off in the north and the far west parts of the lake. And if you look at those same salinities, same locations out by Stansbury Island, the salinity is substantially higher there at 1 meter just by random distribution across the lake and the date you choose to sample. Okay, next slide. And so there's also variability within the water column, as Christine noted. And so we have 3 deep sites on the lake. We have one in the Northwest Basin, we call that our Site 9, one deep in the Southern Basin, that's Site 6, and then one in between off of Fremont Island, that's Site 3. And so the graphs you see here are salinity profiles taken at 3 consecutive sampling dates this spring. On the y-axis, 0 is the surface of the lake going down in depth. And then across the x-axis is the salinity of those measurements. And then each set of lines is a different sampling date. And you can see there's a substantial amount of variability as you go through the water column this year. And you can see quite clearly the effect of freshwater inflows freshening the surface layers and mixing down gradually through the depth. And you can see that progression as you go from the gray line, which was March 7th, before we had this large rush of inflow. And then the salinity just keeps marching back as you go through time, even at depth. And so, John, we're talking about the deep brine layer potentially in the Northwest Basin is very clearly evident on March 7th, where salinity is over 200 grams per liter, and that's a pretty clear indicator of North Arm water that was there. But as the lake is freshened, that brine layer has declined to the point where at about 160, 170 grams per liter, it's the same as what the surface waters were back on March 7th. So it might be a remnant of some of the surface waters that just haven't mixed yet. It may not have originated from the North Arm. It's kind of hard to tell, but regardless, a gradual reduction and disappearance of the deep brine layer. Okay, next slide. And the interesting thing about that is if we contrast the spring of 2023, which are the graphs I just showed on the last slide, that's the top row here, with the same time period in 2022 when there was very minimal runoff, we can see that the heterogeneity is much greater in 2023. And so a year ago, you could reasonably sample, 1 meter, 3 meter, 5 meter at any of these sites, and you could do it in between, March 15th and May 16th, and you'd be getting about the same salinity measurement. Either way, there just was not a lot of variability with the depth or space on the lake when the river inflow was so low. This year, it's a different story, a high level of variability. Next slide, Jeff. And so this set of plots are taking 2 individual sample dates. The left graph is April 26, 2023, and the right graph is April 20th, 2022. And essentially, it's just plotting all of our individual data points on that sample date according to the depth they were calculated and captured at, and then the salinity that was in that sample from all 9 sites on a given date. And so the graph on the left, 2023, we can see a substantial amount of variability. Higher variability, the shallower you are in the water column between sites, and that starts to taper down as you go down to depth. Go ahead and click, Jeff. In 2022, this circle covers what's basically considered the epilimnion, the oxygenated upper layers of the water column. Very little variability in salinity across the x-axis in 2022, regardless of which site you sampled. Again, Jeff. These data points represent the epilimnion on April 26, and you can see that depending on where you sample and at what depth, your salinity value is going to range from about 135 to 155 grams per liter. And so essentially for this year, there's a lot of variability between sites, a lot of variability with the depth, and it requires essentially a heavier sampling effort on a given date in order to have any confidence that the values you're getting are representative of what's out there in Gilbert Bay as a whole. And so, and the closer you get to the surface, the higher that variability is going to be just by the influence of that fresh water not mixing in thoroughly. And so contrasted to a low runoff like 2022, lower variability across the lake and with depth. And so it takes much less sampling effort to get a more confident estimate of what the average salinity across Gilbert Bay might be on a given date. And so as we go forward and we try to consider, what's the management effect of what's the salinity of the lake at a given point in time, this is something we probably need to be pretty careful about this year with all the river inflow. Make sure that we're getting an accurate estimate of what the salinity actually is in the south arm. I think that's it.
All right, great. Any questions or discussion?
It's more about the berm. Probably going to talk about that.
Bill?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this is consistent with some of the conceptual ideas we have about the way the lake mixes, right? Where we know that freshwater inflows kind of move into Carrington Bay first, going on the north side of Fremont Island. And, those of us who've been out there sampling it have experienced that big current coming in this time of year. And so that surface freshening makes perfect sense. The fact that it propagates southward, as well as when the deep brine layer starts coming in, it propagates southward. So when you have those transients, you get a lot more variability because you're looking across the transient. And so it just underlines, it's really good data, Phil, and it underlines the need to expand from a hydrodynamic model at the breach to a neural network or other combination of models that really give you a sense of how to simulate these transients across the bigger system. And if we can do that, then this data will not be so mysterious. We'll actually be able to predict how this variability will play out over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I think I was thinking about the discussions we've been having about, the critical salinity thresholds and how does that fit into our protocol? And I think in the last, I think as we were developing the berm management protocol, one of the things that really popped in my mind or realization was that, we've identified that range of salinities that was most beneficial to the uses around the lake. One of the key items that we were looking at was really, well, what is the salinity in the spring and really the first generation of brine shrimp to hatch, right? And so I think, and so that was a key point, I think, in our discussion about the protocols to where, when we measure the salinity in the spring, we want to make sure we're low enough to be able to enable that hatch, but then also to have enough buffer for the inevitable increase in salinity that we would observe over the year. So I guess looking at this data, we're seeing a lot of variability, especially in the shallow layers. And I guess the question that comes to mind is when we're looking at the spring salinity values, and comparing that against what we'd like to see for that first generation of cysts to hatch, I guess where are the cysts in the spring? Are they in that top meter, 3 meters that are observing that? So when we're measuring, it seems like if we're measuring salinity during the rest of the year when we don't have a lot of inflow, the depth doesn't appear to be as important as it does when we have inflows and we have those dynamic flow patterns in the lake. So I guess the question is when we're measuring in the spring, when we want to make sure we have that low salinity, is it enough to measure near the surface? Is that where the cysts are? Or how do we characterize the salinity in the spring?
Phil, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what we've typically seen historically is that the buoyancy of the cysts in Great Salt Lake are close to neutral buoyancy, regardless of what salinity they were produced. And we see the buoyancy, we see a lot of variability in buoyancy through a lot of different factors. So time is a factor, and that makes sense. It's cysts are metabolizing, and the metabolites change in the density of the embryo and therefore can change what the buoyancy of the cyst is. So we're seeing the cyst throughout the water column for the most part. Occasionally we see some cysts accumulating on the surface when they get trapped in those fresher layers of water, but for the most part we see them throughout the water column. We also see a significant portion of cysts that tend to be benthic, at least during periods of the year. And we see these cysts that are benthic have a very similar dormancy patterns as the cysts that are in the water column, suggesting that over time, you know, they end up mixing up, or over time, you know, they end up in the water column. So it's a very dynamic, the buoyancy is very dynamic. It changes over time. And for the most part, we find cysts throughout the water column. Is that accurate, Bill?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Is there a heavier population distribution in any one phase, or it's equal throughout the water column? Not just presence, I guess.
I mean, we're still trying to sort of get to the bottom of buoyancy. A lot of research on it. And it's a very complex matter. So it's, you know, kind of difficult question to answer at this point.
But with greater salinity as of late, you've not seen more buoyancy.
Absolutely not. In fact, in the North Arm in the late 90s, when in 1999, when the division shut down the harvest in the South Arm, we went north. You could see barely any cysts on the water surface, but when we sampled, we actually found a significant amount of cysts in the water column. And that salinity was probably 25, 26%. Go figure.
So I guess an important question as we start to talk about the protocol, think about that. It's going to be, well, when we measure the salinity, especially for those spring values, you know, at what depth do we look at? And I think this is consistent with, you know, when, you know, John, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember the tag at your technical advisory group at GSLSAC, you're measuring salinity. And I remember there's often a comment in the spring, your spring tag, that, oh, this might just have been a freshwater lens that was sampled. So I think that's very consistent with this. Yeah. And but I mean, what are your thoughts in terms of, you know, especially in the spring when we're measuring salinity, you know, when we're trying to evaluate how things can fluctuate or change throughout the year, you know, is what are folks' thoughts as to where we should be measuring? I guess is what it comes down to. I know we've got a great historical data set at the 1 meter shallow layer that I think we want to preserve. But I guess with this information and what we're learning, you know, I guess what are your thoughts?
I mean, no specific thoughts yet about exactly what to use, but just generally speaking, we'd be happy to share our information. We have a pretty good historic data set as well. We did use a refractometer salinity only in the past, although we have, you know, pretty good correlation between the refractometer salinity and, you know, density measurements in USOP that we developed, the Salinity Advisory Committee. Right now, we're still continuing our refractometer counts, but we're also adding the protocol that we developed here. We're happy to share these data, if nothing else, to see what the variability is, and because it is possible that over time, as these inflows decrease, we should start to see more homogeneity in these data. We're happy to, you know, present that. And there might be two ways to look at it. You could try and integrate these different salinity measurements using the bathymetry, you know, or the whole lake. We could add the half a meter that the Division of Wildlife Resources measures, which I think it's more shallow than 50 centimeters. It's more like 25 centimeters. I mean, we could even add that. We can add the USGS and UGS salinity and integrate it over the lake. That would be one thing, or we could just wait until we get more homogeneity in the data take that as, you know, a point of measurement.
I mean, I would, you know, I would align behind that sort of thinking in terms of if we want to depart from one data set or expand how we look at it, that we continue the run that we're on with this long-standing data set for multiple agencies, and with more data, if we can have better understanding of that variability and we want to depart, we'll at least have a, you know, kind of a ramp up and a ramp down, you know, with a statistically significant data set.
I think it'd be really neat to look at that because the analysis we did and say, you know, we think it's robust, but that's given the data we have, which is, you know, taken twice per year, 7 sites, whereas yours is, you know, much more, you know, vertically discrete, more measurements throughout the water column as well as thoroughly resolute. I mean, there's many things that your data captured that ours don't. But I think it's what we make a recommendation in the paper is that this springtime, the way we're thinking about it is in the springtime, you get this huge influx of water. Our salt tear gauge is measuring that daily, right, continuously. So it's picking that up right away. Whereas our salinity measurements we're pairing it with are delayed. It's taking a long time to mix in. And so we're likely pairing like higher salinities, not yet dilute salinities with this higher lake elevation gauge. And so we say, don't use springtime measurements to estimate the annual load. And we actually propose using a July through November estimate, maybe a mean, to compute an annual estimate of salt load in the South Arm. Another idea that has been proposed in the past is just using salt mass calculated at the low lake level in a given year. But definitely being aware of when there is more greater variability in the salinity data throughout the lake. And it'd be really interesting to compare, as Phil has done, with this year and previous years, because in my limited experience, this is a pretty extraordinary year. And so how many of these years have we seen in the past? Are we usually okay with the spring runoffs we typically have gotten in the last year? I don't know. That's just a question, but having a greater, you know, more data to work with would be a great opportunity.
But as it relates to a berm management protocol, though, I mean, the narrative is looking at what the spring, you know, what the spring salinity is. You know, just from a tighter sort of management perspective.
Right, you're right. That seasonal variability matters. Yeah.
And you're really solving for what it's going to be in October, presumably when it's lowest, just to try to get, you know, knowing that there could be a, you know, 30 grams per liter swing.
And I think what Phil did here is he just showed two extremes in order to demonstrate this type of temporal variability from year to year. But obviously we could, you know, look at our whole data set, come up with a more in-depth analysis. But I don't think I mean, given how we've been calculating salt mass and how you know, USGS and our data ultimately for salt mass have been quite close, I don't think it would be a problem to take this kind of data and, you know, combine it with everybody else's data. And again, you know, try and calculate salt mass salinity. We can go either way, I think.
Yeah.
But just to talk to, but I know we're already, you know, we've made the recommendation for the protocol as it stands, but I think this really plays into like how we do this into the future. So if there is a way that we can start looking at the data and how they correlate, and if there's a way that we can take an average or just, you know, have a better picture of that, or maybe we're not like, maybe we don't need to be basing it off of information during the high runoff because it's so variable, and we try to focus on before runoff and, you know, July, August to make that decision. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I think if we could start comparing those data, I think that'd be the way to go. Someone smarter than me, like Christine or Ryan here, could probably make good sense of it.
But wouldn't that be June though, like when the runoff stops?
It depends on the year.
Yeah,
Right?
that is a good point. You do want to get that salinity in the spring if you want to, you know, decide on how you manage.
Because if we're planning for, you know, the mechanics of
exactly
of berm management, you know, which I know takes you time.
It's also going to depend on, you know, like I think when runoff stops, that's one thing. But then if we like this year, if we have a 3.5 foot head difference and we're already exporting salt out, I don't think we're going to be, you know, pulling but we'll have to decide when it's appropriate to pull the berm down, right? Like to finish exporting the rest and how that works and whatnot. So I don't know what the timing would be. I was just to kind of going off the
Bill had his hand up. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just bingo on the, you can't really forecast these decisions based on salinity during spring runoff because you have two ends of the system, right? You've got the export from the south to the north occurring as you've got this inflow coming in. But remember that depending on the berm height, we get import back from the north through the deep brine layer. And that, of course, is controlled now by the berm height. And as we've discussed before, if you let that back into the south arm and then the south arm destratifies, you end up with a much higher average salinity in the south arm than you otherwise would. And so you have to look at both ends of this, which means you can't do this in May or June. You have to do this later on in the year when you understand how much has gone to the north arm and how much could potentially come back.
So that's kind of what I was saying, and you said it much more elegantly, but I think like have some type of equation that looks at where we started at before runoff and then where we left off after we began to see the north arm leveling off, if that's happened, any given year. And of course, we have to think more about this in years that aren't extreme like this. Like I think this year, my assumption is that we'll level out on both sides eventually,
but there's probably an elevation somewhere between 92 and we showed that 87 we were pretty much blocking the north to south flow, if I recall. That's correct. Materially blocking it. I mean, there may have been some minor spillover, but in order to maintain some connection, and I mean, we're going to need to make a decision, at some point, like how much export based on the inflow. And the protocol is suggesting 10%.
Yeah, and I think that that's something we would look at. So, once that starts to level off, and so like this year, it might be more like July because there's so much water that it takes. We would have to figure out what the salinity at that point is, and then how much room we even have in the north arm. This year, there may be no room. I'm guessing that it's going to level off and will be somewhere in a happy medium. I don't know if you have any different predictions, but
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, I think it's spilling now and it's going to continue to rise. So at the point the south arm hits, 4195 or something like that, and it continues to spill. Well, I mean, we're only 2 feet away and we still have like 50% of our snowpack. So, I think it's feasible. But if we do that and it continues to spill into the north arm, and bring the levels up, or I would assume it's going to go faster, it'll accumulate faster than it's evaporating. So we'll continue to rise, and at some point it'll hit that 4192 will contribute to that much water, right?
That's the question, right, Joe? I think from your perspective is how much evaporation now starts to play into that equation.
Yeah, I mean, I wish the opening was large enough. Mm-hmm. You had enough flux over that opening to provide a volume of water that's going to exceed the evaporation rate. That's unlikely. It's an unknown at this point, but I mean, you're gonna approach that equilibrium where there's nothing coming into the
anecdotally, they start to cut into that berm. Folks have been out there recently. We're starting to get a little V notch going in the middle, so it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, it's quite a wave that was going.
I mean, not to discount this, but I think that if that was the case and it cut a V notch into it, it wouldn't be the worst case scenario because we were able to impound that water. We had that benefit of letting it mix for the spring and doing its thing. And if we needed to go in and repair that, we could. I don't know if we can do it while it's running high, but
no need right now.
Exactly. I don't think there is either. So I think as it plays out, though, my point being is just that, come July, when we start to get a better picture of what that salinity looks like and how much room there is to export salt and water, then we'll know exactly what we would want to do. I think that's how I'm interpreting this protocol. I don't know if anybody else has it.
Sure. I mean, I guess, is there any sense like what the inflow is looking like? 1 million plus acre feet, or?
Yeah, I don't have a good feel for that right now. But I'm with Ben. There's a lot of snow yet to come. So we'll have a much clearer picture here in 3-4 weeks. So
I'd just say on that, I mean, this is interesting. I've been nobody seems to have an answer to that question. But some of the things that we haven't seen
that potentially, well, one of the things that's happened is cracking Willard, right? So that'll bring more water, really from the Weaver system. It's sort of coming in two directions now. The other one that we really haven't seen yet, we saw on some of the early data, is stuff from the south just haven't. And that's because it's all going to Utah Lake. When Utah Lake hits compromise or before compromise, the cottonwood starts spilling. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of inflows we get from the south, but we haven't really seen today. I mean, Goggins, what, like an average? Anyway, that those are just some interesting dynamics, but there are other things happening so much later than it normally would.
Yeah, I don't disagree that maybe this year, maybe July is, going to be more indicative just because of the probable lag and inflow. But also just the planning piece of, what a release looks like for the program.
Sure. In my opinion, it has to be dynamic. They have to look at it each year and say, what were temperatures like? Would it be the peak runoff, and adjust accordingly so we're getting the best results and informing our decision on how much to lower it and whatnot.
Well, I want to make sure we've got time to talk about the SOP before we finish. But I think it